Welcome to our panel discussion. I am going to be handing over to the panelists to have a discussion on some of the topics which we touched on earlier. So over to you guys. Enjoy this next session.
Thank you, Zintle. And thank you, Zenzele, for allowing us the opportunity to use this platform to, I think, enrich each other's understanding with regards to RegTech. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for our panel discussion. I'm Yvonne Rossouw. I will be your panel moderator for today. And just a quick introduction. I work for ProBeta Training, which is quite a small consultancy company in South Africa, and we provide risk and compliance consulting and training to financial service providers. So our panel discussion is on RegTech, and I think as entities within the financial industry, it is important to understand the difference between RegTech and FinTech, like Dr. Yin also explained to us. Although for most financial service providers, of course, it may be integrated, it is two very distinct concepts, and I think that's where we should start. Of course, where FinTech provides solutions in the finance industry to enable us to enhance the way we provide our services. RegTech, on the other side, rather is how we use technology to solve regulatory problems to comply with legislation. Naturally, this can be applicable to more than just the finance industry, but today we are focusing on our finance industry and financial service providers. Currently, we find ourselves in the fourth industrial revolution. And when it started in 2016, I think no one, not even Klaus Schwab himself, could have anticipated COVID and the effect it would have not only on our personal lives, but also on the business world. However, I do believe that we would have been far worse off if it was not for the fourth industrial revolution and the innovative technological solutions that we do have available thanks to technology and the fourth industrial revolution. So without further ado, let's get to know our panelists a little bit. I know some of them have presented some sessions to you during the day, so we'll ask them some pressing questions, and if you would like to, you can let us know in the chat if you have any specific questions, and we'll find time to address that during the panel discussion as well. Our first panelist for today that I would like to pose a question to is Yurika Pistorius. And as the Group Compliance Officer at Clientele Limited, Yurika, I'm sure that you have experienced firsthand the trials and tribulations of compliance requirements, mostly from a practical perspective. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today to share your insights.
Thank you, Yvonne. Much appreciated. Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies. I only joined for the panel session. I couldn't attend all the other presentations. I was busy with what Geoff and Hugo spoke about, the regulators. So that's the fun of my job, right, is to make sure that we deal with the regulators appropriately and make also sure that we're on the same page. I think that's a very important thing going forward through regulations, is that we need to be on the same page, us as financial services providers as well as the regulators. And I think the moment if we see one another as a team, we'll be able to actually improve efficiencies and obviously protect our policyholders. So yeah, Yvonne, that's just a quick background about myself. But yeah, very excited to be here. So thank you so much for including me in this.
It's a pleasure. Yurika, my first question to you, what in your opinion is the most pressing legislation or regulation that currently affects financial service providers, especially if we look at the time and effort it takes to comply and the consequences should we not comply?
Absolutely. I think one of the comments I always make to say is that the regulatory landscape of our universe is changing. It's a constant changing event. I had a chat the other day. I was speaking at one of the conferences, and we said that there's about 700 to 800 pieces of legislation that's affecting banks and affecting insurance companies in South Africa. So bear in mind, I'm talking from a South Africa's perspective. Just on the top of my mind, things that we've identified as high risks or high regulations in South Africa currently. First of all, is something that Geoff will be very passionate about, is the Cybercrimes Act. Cybercrimes is all of this sudden, have past 4 years, 5 years, been one of the regulatory risks for all companies worldwide. Second of all, we have what we call a draft national data and cloud policy. You can see the interlink between all the IT stuff going forward. If I talk about AML or money laundering specifically, I talk about the FATF recommendations. Our FICA is your money laundering legislation and guidance note. We have something called promotion of access to information, very much to what Geoff and Hugo was talking about, is the access to that specific information, how we can deal with it appropriately. And then we have something equivalent to what you have as GDPR and the Secrecy Act is the Protection of Personal Information Act. All of that has something to do with some sort of technology. All of that has something to do with conduct to make sure that our policyholders or our customers are protected. And most of all, that our shareholders and us as entities are protected. And again, I think our job as compliance officers is to make sure that all the shareholders are protected, not just from I think we forget that. I think we tend to think that we just need to make sure that our company is sorted. It is not. We need to make sure that our regulators are happy, that our customers are happy, that our shareholders are happy, and obviously that our employees understand these regulations, because it's those people that vicariously bind us with the specific customers in terms of these laws. So it's been an interesting time, Yvonne, for I think every compliance officer worldwide. COVID really excelled this for us.
Yes.
So the legislation just came absolutely in time to make sure about that. And then, we have mobile devices. That's becoming our life. I remember when I was a child, we used to have normal telephones. It was wonderful. You could only speak to people when it was really necessary. Now, all of a sudden, we have to have constant contact. And it's that contact that's becoming a risk for us as financial services providers. However, as good as it is, for every opportunity, there is always a threat. And I think the threat for that is then our cyber crimes risk, or potentially our IT or our artificial intelligence risk.
How would you say did COVID impact on those risks? Specifically, if I think about things like cybersecurity and protection of data, I mean, people working from home, having access to information at home, how has that changed the risk there?
I think, again, from our side, first of all, we tend to think we can deal with everything in a policy. A policy is not going to deal with it. It's the culture of dealing with that specific policy. All of us has to come through a VPN into a secure data port. It's not just having a VPN, it's making sure that it's backed up, that there's some data that's coming through, that the customer's information is protected, that personal information is protected. I think what we've seen is we had a couple of hard lockdowns. I know the UK also had a couple of hard lockdowns and still continuing. It really had an effect on the way that we do business. Obviously, it affected production, but it affected the way that we interact with people. All of a sudden, our customers, who's not technology savvy, has to interact with us by way of some way of mobile or internet or self-service platform. And what we see it on a daily basis, is cyber attacks. You will read our own information regulator and Department of Treasury has had some sort of potential information leakage. Now, that's a big thing for us because we submit our information to this regulator. So I guess all of a sudden, we did normal business. We had to excel in this to say that it's a data-driven business. I think, Hugo, you mentioned a bit earlier, it's paramount. For me, I would like to say data is a commodity. It's all of a sudden become something on a trading platform. I think it has a lot of value in it, and you need to treat it appropriately. I think, Yvonne, for us, it was very much in instilling the practice of when you deal with data, it's somebody's information. In other words, deal with the data how you would deal with your own personal information. COVID really changed it for us. We had to up our game in terms of cybersecurity, not only cover, but in terms of systems, penetration tests, making sure that our IT systems are strong enough to deal with all of this data. The IT risk or the information risk is forever and a day going to be the highest risk for now and going forward for any type of company. Every one of us here are daily exposed to a cyber attack. We are, as we currently speaking, probably there's some sort of attack coming into our offices without us knowing that, because we have malware, we have the necessary screening that can help with that. So I think the compliance world merged so nicely with IT. I wish actually I could speak to people here face to face, but I think we've seen that compliance is coming together with IT to only look at laws and regulations, but bringing the IT solution with that to say, this is what the law says, but how do we implement it that employees can use it, but also that customers are protected in the process? I hope
No,
that
definitely.
answers.
So the use of
Yeah.
technology
Yeah.
becoming more and more important. Which leads me to our second panelist for today, and you've heard about from him previously, Hugo. And Hugo, in your presentation, you discussed how technology can be used to overcome regulatory hurdles. And as someone who, I mean, you've been with Moody's Analytics since 2019 as their Director of Anti-Financial Crime Solutions. So I'm sure you're in a position to provide perfect opportunity to provide some well-needed thought leadership in the anti-money laundering, anti-financial crime area, reg tech area. So also from your side, thank you for being here today. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Thanks for that, Yvonne. Yes, I appreciate the intro. It's a really, really interesting question. And I think apathy is probably the immediate word that springs to mind, unfortunately. Technology is as technology does, is kind of a slightly chuck-away comment. But I think in English, what we're saying here is an awful lot of institutions are institutionalized. That's probably the expression that would immediately spring to mind. So I think when we're talking about a solution, we probably are getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, because we need to talk about the concept in the first instance.
Definitely.
And again, to pick up very, very much on Yurika's point as well, it's about the data, and it's that commodity, it's the value that's placed in that, because at the moment it's not being harnessed, it's not being effectively used, and it's certainly not being considered in the way that it should be, because again, numerous parts of different organizations will have a different lens or a different face to that client. And the analogy that I draw is, if you have an individual who is a director of a company that's involved in a debt capital markets transaction, who also happens to be a wealth manager of that particular organization, but in a completely different office, in a different jurisdiction, and chances are the DCM guys don't know about the wealth guys, and the wealth guys don't know about the DCM guys. And okay, it's a slightly polar expression, and the analogy that I draw is such that without appropriate technology, you are unlikely to have a single face to that client. And even with technology, it's still difficult, but it's about having the right technology. So that really goes back to the point that I was saying before about understanding the power of that data and what it's actually telling you. So I think from that regard, one of the biggest hurdles that we face as a vendor effectively to financial services, and again, with my background being financial services for more years than I care to remember, I can speak with a degree of knowledge and experience there, that there is a huge hurdle in terms of the potential uplift, or the problems that would be created by bringing a new vendor on board or a new supplier. So that is one of the reasons why typically people will retain their existing agreements, because that's what they've always done. So there needs to be an element of pain on their part, because again, it's not a straightforward transaction. It's a difficult process, and we accept and recognize that. So what we talk about internally is the uplift being transformational. So that is what we look to achieve when we're talking to any financial institution. Typically, with an organisation such as Moody's, the knock is quite loud. So again, we're tending now to have conversations a little bit further up the value chain. So rather than speaking to the local head of compliance or the regional head of KYC, we're talking to the chief risk officer, or we're talking to the money laundering reporting officer, somebody who is not necessarily a writer of checks, but somebody who possibly has the ear of somebody who is able to actually say, yeah, this is value, this is a value-based proposition, and we can go with it. So that's kind of what I'm seeing in the market currently.
Yeah, and I think what I hear you saying is that there needs to be strategy behind it. You can't just have technology and it's there. You need some kind of plan behind it. But there is that saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So I'm wondering, from your side, your practical experience, what you have seen, the culture and I think the mindset of people when it comes to technology, and especially that balance that you talked about, trying to balance technology with people, with data. Is everyone on board, or do you still get a lot of hesitancy towards technology?
Again, that's another excellent question. I suppose to an extent the genie is out of the bottle when it comes to the implementation of technology, and again, one of the terminologies I would use is it's there, so we might as well use it. It's there for a reason, and it's been there for a while. Certainly when I look at things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, this is a little bit Star Trek to a lot of the people that we're talking to, but that doesn't mean that we can't explain it. And I have this expression again: if I can't explain something to my 12-year-old daughter, I don't understand it. So at the moment, I'm just about able to explain it to her, and I think she just about gets it. She's probably due home from school any minute now, so I'll be able to ask her. But my point there is it's different things for different organizations, because they will be at different stages of their maturity, and they may also be under some form of regulatory duress. And again, just picking up on Yurika's point, a lot of the instances that we see are where the organizations will actually blow the whistle on themselves. So whether they like it or whether they don't, they're going to be under enhanced regulatory scrutiny over and above what they would typically experience. Now, very often, the regulators will say, okay, here's a list of approved consulting firms that you need to engage with. They're going to talk tech, whether you like it or whether you don't, because realistically, that's the only practical solution to manage the scale of the issues that these organizations face. So from experience, any resistance that I get is normally relatively minimal. I think there is a general acceptance now that it is the way forward. And I touched on it before as well when I looked at perpetual KYC. That wasn't even a thing 3-4 years ago. Yeah, there's an organization that we're talking to currently, and we're quite engaged with them. We've been talking to them for about 18 months, but it was only really when so again, to get that first deal, if you will, over the line, to get that first instance to say, hey, look, guys, it works, go and speak to these guys if you're not sure, that's a really, really powerful position to be in, because typically you never want to be the first adopter. You want to be early, but you don't necessarily want to be the first, and you want to learn from other people's mistakes.
Learn from someone else's mistakes. Yes.
Exactly that.
Yes,
Yeah. So that's kind of where we are again, just sort of seeing that as a barometer of the market currently. But again, I think value proposition is absolutely the thing. And again, a strategy in terms of the way that we position it with a client is to understand and again, be a bit consultative, which again, partly is my background. So, it's understanding from their point of view where the pain is, but equally how good is your data? And if your data's not all good, let's look at the stuff that is, treat that one way, and the stuff that's not so good, let's treat that a different way. And let's apply a bit of common sense, have a risk-based approach. So this is, again, to some organizations, still quite a new concept. It's still, again, a little bit out there, because from their point of view, they're thinking, well, we've always done what we've always done, so we'll always get what we always got, sort of thing. And we're saying you don't need to live like that anymore. The world's moved on.
No, definitely. On the topic of data, and I think especially if we look at big data, the type of data that we are confronted with in our day and age, our next panelist that I would like to go to is Dr. Yin Lu. She's the head of product at Cube, specifically the product RegBrain. And for those of you who are privileged enough to listen to her presentation, she also has the voice of an angel. So thank you for that. She did a brilliant retake of Every Move You Make from the Police. Thank you for joining us here today.
How do I respond to that gracious introduction, Yvonne? No, thank you so much. I do think about communication in a very scientific way, which is why I do try to sing, even at work in meetings. Trust me, I do it all the time. Appropriate, in that, it adds certain dimension to communication, right? And so, Cube, basically, let me just kind of summarize what I do at Cube for a high level for more context. So we are in that kind of top of the funnel RegTech space, as I mentioned in my presentation. Founded in 2011, that was before RegTech was even a thing. So one of the earliest, it kind of helped, we helped define the category of RegTech, if that makes sense. So really quite difficult initially, I think, to persuade people. We were lucky with a few key banks, key clients early on. And it's really evolved since then. But AI, coupled with human experts in-house, SMEs, legal compliance SMEs, has been the DNA of Cube. But it's the confluence of the two, and the AI is absolutely critical. There's 2 AI teams, okay, to make me clear. And what we do with the AI is at a very high blanket level. We take all this data, millions upon millions of data points, and we translate it into intelligence or insight. Easier said than done. And it's basically, we've got 20 domains, I suppose, and counting, from FinCrime, privacy, cybersecurity, etc. 180 countries, 3,000 plus issuing bodies across those countries, 60 plus languages translated as well. And we help the clients understand, okay, what's relevant to us, and then how do we map it onto internal infrastructure, which is the impact part, equally important as the relevance part. And all of that is fueled by, again, AI, with the fine-tuning from the experts. Now, RegBrain is the newer AI team. The existing one has been around for many years. They focus on transforming data, right? From these, horrible-looking, PDFs, image files, you name it. HTML is a blessing.
Files.
Yeah. But we have computer vision to help out with the images, all sorts of AI, and we structure it into XML files. We classify everything against our ontology. We translate. We know who are the children sections versus the parent, the TOCs, all that, and over time as well. Now, RegBrain is, we take that and it's the semantics, it's natural language understanding. Easier said than done. But this is what really helps, I think, the next level of AI in RegTech. This is what it is. It's, okay, we can get the rules out. What do they mean? How do regs relate to each other? What are the trends that we're seeing, right? And it goes beyond just keyword matching, of course. That was the earliest possible iteration. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, definitely. And I wanted to ask you specifically from your presentation, where I think you said most RegTech currently it's almost output-based, where it's more geared towards the model and the algorithms and the output it can give for compliance, rather than input-based. And there's still a lot of data that has to go into these RegTechs, to give you those models and the outputs.
Exactly.
And I think maybe you can allude more towards the challenges with regards to, especially if we now have quite a lot of data, big data as a company, and as you said, it's on these PDF files, these Excel files. How can we get that into the RegTech, and how does AI and analytics, I guess, help us in that sense?
That's a great question. I think it's a great point, referencing what I said earlier about, yes, the models are there, and they are very, very sophisticated now, thanks to all the advances made in machine learning, NLP over the past 4 years. It's been next level. But the data point, you can't really automate that without AI plus the humans, right? And it's very complex. It's okay. So regulatory data, you have the regulations themselves, which encompass the dirtier PDFs with the cleaner HTML. You have other kinds of data that provide signals for horizon scanning. There's maybe like 60 to 100 plus different types, like even blog posts, announcements, updates from these websites. I think Geoff showed a fantastic example in his presentation of just one of these, and there's thousands per day of these, at least tens of thousands. So all of that needs to basically come together, and it's the relationships, the cross references between, so how do these updates relate to the regs? And then, of course, further downstream, you have the user data, which helps influence relevance, right? So you can do based upon explicit plus implicit feedback, explicit being, okay, there's a thumbs up or a thumbs down, for example, on the platform, like or don't like, or just, the time spent looking at something, lots of different metrics there, right? And we can kind of bring that together with the regulatory data, which is already quite rich, and that helps fine tune things. That being said, there's also data we haven't, even at Cube, we're looking to bring in other kinds of data, like, Wikipedia, for example, other kinds of internet, even social media data, to help gain some more signal, because real world events are what drive regulation. Okay. So if we can bring those real world event, the news data in a richer way, that further enhances the really cool use case of prediction, does it not? But that data aspect is often overlooked. It's not as sexy as the models themselves, right? But to me, that's the key challenge. The models are almost off the shelf. A lot of them are pre-trained, on legal data as well. It's amazing. There's a legal version of BERT. Did you know that? BERT being one of the top language models today, very, very, very sophisticated. But again, the data problem, that is what the human element will come in there, the curation of it, the cleaning of it, understanding
the robot will not take us, will not take our jobs away.
No, absolutely. I think they'll make our jobs more interesting.
Easier, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, not necessarily more interesting is not necessarily easier.
Easier, yeah. Let's maybe not easier for the people who have to create the programs, but I think for the users at the end of the day, hopefully easier.
For the user, for the end user, absolutely.
Yes.
But I think just to kind of quote my distinguished fellow panelist here, Hugo is just saying it's a transformation, right? So it's not the benefit. I would say, yeah, it's easier. But that's not how I'd frame it. The benefit of RegTech AI and tech in general and AI, in regulation and compliance, is that it's a new way of doing compliance. Not just easier, but it's like it changes the mindset, the culture, the process, as Yurika was mentioning as well. That's what attracts me to RegTech right now. We're kind of beginning to shift that.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think just to summarize on that, technology is important to allow you to be able to use your data, because it's one thing to have a lot of information. I mean, we can go on the internet and find literally anything, but if you're not able to utilize that and to work through it and to use it in the way you need to use it, it's at the end of the day sometimes useless. And I think that brings us to our final panelist for today. One of the uses, of course, of data is then surveillance. And we had quite an interesting discussion from Geoff Brooks. He's the general manager and founder at First Step MEA. And he gave us a bit of insight into how surveillance can be done and why it is quite necessary. So welcome, Geoff. Thank you for your insights there, and happy to have you here today.
Delighted to be here. Thank you very much, Yvonne.
In response to your presentation, and I think also something that Yurika mentioned, the whole thing about data protection and data privacy, I was wondering if you can maybe give us some feedback on how regulation regarding anti-money laundering, anti-financial crime that drives surveillance interacts with the data privacy side of it. And I think also as to how we said working from home and having to monitor those working from home for work purposes, of course, especially if they start using their phones like WhatsApp and those type of applications. When we monitor and surveil those applications on their phone, how does it interact with their privacy at the end of the day?
It's a tough one, Yvonne. It really is. And we've been, as some of our panelists have already mentioned earlier, we've been fast tracked into scenarios that we never imagined. We've had to deal with. 80% of our workforce working from home, all of a sudden, overnight. It's just unimaginable, and something many companies just couldn't plan for. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I was in London and I saw big white transit vans pulling up to outside banks like JP Morgan, Royal Bank of Scotland, big vans, and they were loading all the IT equipment into the back of the vans, all the screens, the monitors, the chairs, and driving them to everybody's houses, right? So they could then use their screens at home. And where I was staying at the time, I saw people at reception in these tower blocks in London, just waiting for the vans and then carrying their screens upstairs because they knew that's where they were going to be for 9 months, right? So we've been forced to work at home, and unfortunately, the technology, the surveillance capabilities weren't there, right, to be able to surveil and monitor. And I've spoken to heads of compliance in tier 1 banks, and they've said, Geoff, I have no idea what's been going on with my guys for the last 18 months, and I feel that in 3, 4, 5 years' time, there's going to be some huge black holes, huge questions to be asked. And explanations to be given about what took place during that blackout period, because I've got no visibility into what happened. And so a lot of these banks have been trying to look at tech and trying to implement tech very quickly to try and address those gaps. And unfortunately, individuals may feel that they're having their privacy invaded in some respects, because if I'm now using my phone and I'm used to talking to my family on WhatsApp, and if that's all now being recorded, then where's the line? Where's the line between my personal and my private? And as I alluded to in my presentation, the mobile is a good example, because that's the thing that's probably being used most often at home. Is many organizations have gone back to the idea of a corporate device being separated from your personal device. Now, there was a trend pre-pandemic of bring your own device, BYOD, because I didn't want to have to carry a second device, and I certainly didn't want to have to use a device that was given to me by my company that perhaps didn't have the features and the functions that I love on my personal device. So technology was going along this BYOD, where we could have a segregation on the mobile device between corporate and private, right? But now, if we're asking the user, actually, we need to put surveillance capability on that device if you're going to use it, and actually we can't segregate between personal and private, then we have to have a rethink about going back to the concept of a corporate device and a personal device, and that's where we're seeing a lot of customers, or a lot of our customers, are now moving back to that idea of corporate devices. If it's a corporate device, then we have an IT policy that very clearly can very clearly mandate what is and isn't recorded, and I think that's the key there, Yvonne.
Thank you very much for that insight. Right. I think at this stage, also looking at the time, we can open the floor for questions from the audience if there are any. I haven't seen any come through yet, but just quickly, if someone has a question, one or two for any of the panelists, that we can address those. Maybe give it a few minutes to see if anything comes through. And while we're waiting to see if anything comes through, maybe just my very last question, any one of the panelists can address this, is towards blockchain. Because to be honest, I have no idea what blockchain even means. I've tried to wrap my head around it, and it's clearly my CA brain just doesn't want to understand. So blockchain and how that can help in the RegTech, what kind of innovative products that can maybe bring to RegTech. I think Geoff, I'm not sure if you would maybe be the first one to address that question.
Yeah, all right. So just very quickly, I actually one of the panelists, I think, has a sorry, one of my colleagues has some thoughts on that, but in the chat box, I've also put a domain for you to just check when you have time. All of you can go check your own company's exposure, right? You mentioned, Yvonne, at the beginning about the risk of working from home and the spike in cybercrime, right? And we all like to think we're protected, but there's a great website where you can go and check on behalf of your company to see, okay, in the last 3 months, whilst I've been working from home, how many of my employees have had their credentials stolen? And it gives you a really good insight. And with regards to blockchain, there's some really innovative capabilities that we're seeing out there. And, I think this whole concept of having a complete audit trail, a global audit trail, and from transaction perspective, for example, is that, and this is what I like, this is what I find fascinating about the concepts of cryptocurrencies and digital asset trading, right? Is, a couple of years ago, we were talking about using cryptocurrency, on the black market, right? To buy and to trade anonymously. But with the concepts of blockchain, we actually have a full audit trail of, where those coins were mined, from the day they were mined right up until the day you take ownership of them. There's a full audit trail, and I think that's really interesting, right? In going forward, we're now seeing RegTech companies evolving that can do on-chain and off-chain analysis of those blocks, right? So we can see the difference between dirty cryptocurrency and clean cryptocurrency. And so I think, fast forward a couple of years, we're now going to have, banks are going to have a very, very clear insight into the audit trail of cryptocurrency, which they don't have with cash today, right? Once cash comes into your account, who knows where that's come from, right? We have no idea where it's been over the past 2-3 years, who's handled it. We've no idea. But with cryptocurrency, there's the ability using blockchain to actually have visibility into and analyze the history of that currency. So for me, I think that's a fascinating thing for blockchain.
Okay. And can that functionality be utilized in other type of technologies? For example, let's say I'm documenting data. Can I use blockchain to create a full audit trail of, where the data's, where I've received it, where I've used it, where it's been? I don't know if something like that is possible. I'm just thinking off the top of my head here.
I'm sure maybe Dr. Yingyin has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that what you just described, Yvonne, is a very clear use case, basically record keeping. And yeah, it could be any kind of online asset, document, coins, whatever it might be. As Geoff said, the key thing is that full transparency, the visibility, the audit trail, which itself produces data that RegTex can then analyze, as it were, multiple ways that RegTex can deal with this. I mean, to me, the most obvious use case is anti-fraud, the whole onboarding aspect of things. I did see I've been in touch with a couple of blockchain art type companies that are trying to help out with identity of the artist when selling art online. So you're seeing it's popping up everywhere. But that whole identity aspect and proving that that there is a certain let's say there's an accountability there, and through that audit trail, the authenticity and making sure that the person is who they say they are. That's the key aspect of it for me.
That's absolutely right. So the concept of an NFT, the NFTs, and I think there was one famous incident recently of an artist who managed to sell his piece of art for $70 million. Right, the first piece of NFT art, and you effectively, you have this trail of the history of that piece of art that's digitally connected through a fingerprint to the artist themselves, that can never ever get lost, no matter how hard you try. That you can never it will never get lost. And we're seeing a lot of innovative ways of monetizing artwork now, even baseball cards, video clips, which you can actually genuinely retain and own the very first video clip of a particular, it could be a sporting event, and we can apply a blockchain fingerprint specifically to that video clip of that very first. It could be when England won the cricket Ashes, or it could it could be anything, but that data is never.
Geoff is getting excited now. You can see Geoff, the moment when he spoke about cricket, Yvonne, he lit up.
Became excited, yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, anyway,
So
my point. Anyway.
So Yvonne, from a practical point of view, I mean, I just love this conversation. From a financial services point of view, if I think about blockchain, and this is how you basically see it, is in the old world, we spoke about Excel spreadsheets and all of that. So you will have your policyholder's name, let's say 1 million policyholders on an Excel spreadsheet, date of onboarding, 1st of January, date of maturity, date of this. But the nice thing about a blockchain, it's almost like a honeycomb. Everything in there is a date stamp specifically to this specific customer. And there's an audit trail always on this individual. So that audit trail will never be deleted. And that's a wonderful thing about the machine learning and the artificial intelligence, is everything about Yvonne or Yurika or Hugo or Geoff is basically documented in that specific honeycomb. Your challenges, or the nice thing that we're seeing about tech all of a sudden, is you're seeing outliers on that, where the CDD or the customer due diligence are being manipulated by the customer. The moment if they submit such perfect documentation, there's such a trigger event that comes to you and say, something is a bit worrisome there. We need to do a bit of more research into this. So I think that's where the technology marries the due diligence or the risk management profiling, how you look at customers. I think it's absolute exciting times for financial services going forward. I think everyone, and I mention again, compliance needs to get a handle on what technology or blockchain or machine learning can mean to you. At the end of the day, I think all of us mentioned that it's not going to take the human intervention away. It's going to actually apply your mind better. So we'll be able to use this technology to mitigate risk. However, there's the risk of cybercrime and there's the risk of leaking of personal information. And we need to weigh that up to say, what is the benefits of this versus then ultimately the customer? I think it's sure, we can talk about this for hours, but it's very exciting.
exciting and interesting times we're living in. And I think one can come to the conclusion that there's no going back. There's no pre-COVID, there's no pre-technology, pre-fourth industrial revolution. The only thing we can do is look ahead and move forward. Technology is here, use it, right? At the end of the day, it does make, it does enhance our life and our work and everything we do. And yeah, it's daunting. I think all of us sometimes a little bit afraid of change, but with a little bit of help, we will all survive it at the end and be so much better for it. So on that note, then, thank you very much for all our panelists for the interesting discussions, the insights, making your time available. It really was a pleasure to have you all here. We did not have any other questions from the audience as far as I could see. We had some interesting discussions there in the chat box from Shamim Ali. So if anybody wants to go and read that regarding blockchain, a few messages she sent us there. Thank you for that. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the panel discussion. And I think I'm then giving back over to Zinhle just to do the final closing.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, for conducting that panel discussion, and to all the members that sat on that panel. Unfortunately, this brings us to the end of today's webinar. It's been wonderful being with you throughout this duration. I hope you learned as much as I did today. And I'd like to thank Capital Markets Africa for creating this platform for all of us to engage and learn as much as we can. Because at the end of the day, it's about leveraging information, and I hope that this seminar achieved that for most people. I'd also like to thank our partners, because without them, this event really couldn't have been a success. So thank you to Moody's Analytics, First Step MEA, and MemberCheck, as well as Cube. So thank you so much for being a part of this webinar today. And of course, to our speakers and our panelists for today, because without them, there would be no discussion. So thank you to Dr. Liu and Sean Thomas, Hugo Veazey, Geoff Brooks, Yurika Pistorius, and Yvonne Rossouw, who was leading that panel discussion earlier. And of course, lastly, thank you to all of you that stayed tuned for today's webinar. We really appreciate the time that you guys took, and for everyone who engaged in our chat room today. And lastly, thank you to Zenzile Ndlovu, who coordinated this whole event. Without his efforts, it also wouldn't have been a success. And so I wish you all a very great evening, and thank you so much for being with us today. Enjoy.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.